When the nuclear war broke out, our family set up a shelter in an abandoned factory. My dad was in charge of construction projects, while my mom handled logistics. My eldest brother, with his impressive abs, turned into a rough man of the fields, thriving in breeding and farming. My second brother, the scholarly black sheep, developed water purification, power generation, and security systems, bringing the abandoned factory back to life. One day in March, I woke up from a nightmare, vaguely remembering that my body was decaying and I was close to death, but now, I was completely intact. Seeing my parents enter the room, I was overjoyed. We were reborn, 2 weeks before the outbreak of the nuclear war. No one knew exactly when the war started. Initially, Country M repeatedly provoked us at the border. After several conflicts, using the deaths of combatants as a pretext, they imposed economic and military sanctions on our country. It was like knocking over a row of dominoes. Many countries joined in, and the disputes continued. By the end of March, the fifth round of negotiations had failed. That evening, nuclear alarms sounded in the southern and central regions of our country. Country M destroyed ports and several crucial military bases. Our country officially entered the war, signaling the outbreak of the nuclear conflict. Enemy nuclear missiles struck various locations, and both of my brothers died in the explosions. Our neighborhood was also attacked. Those fortunate enough were drawn in a lottery to enter well-protected underground bunkers. We could only take refuge in a parking garage. It was inadequate against the blast wave. The intense shock caused us injuries, and the subsequent nuclear dust was unstoppable. We quickly became contaminated, first with vomiting, diarrhea, and itchy skin, and then our chromosomes began to change. No matter what medication we took to block the effects or boost our immunity, even transplanting white blood cells, nothing worked. In a hazy memory, my skin peeled off, my mucous membranes were damaged, and I lay in bed like a puddle of mud, often needing emergency care due to organ failure and severe bleeding. My parents died quickly. I wanted to die too, but I didn't even have the strength to do so. It was the most desperate and painful time. Fortunately, we came back unscathed. Our family embraced each other, crying tears of joy. After crying, we began to strategize. My dad glanced at the calendar. We've only got a week left. We need to call the older boys back and find a shelter. At that statement, we all fell silent. Nuclear missiles had struck many places, and even areas that weren't directly hit were contaminated with nuclear dust. If there were any safe places, they would be the large, strongly fortified government bunkers, but those places required a lottery for entry, and resources like food and medicine were scarce there. After a long time, my dad decided, we'll consider the location later, let's start preparing now. I immediately called my older brothers, who were still at school, and told them to come home quickly. They were very confused on the phone. Clearly, they didn't have the memories from our previous life. Only my parents and I were reborn. In a rush, I made up a wild excuse. Some guys at school bullied me again, and when Dad went to confront them, he was severely injured. If you don't come back now, it might be too late. I successfully persuaded them to book the earliest flight. By this time, my parents were already preparing the supplies. For food, we could only bring items that were easy to store and carry: chocolate, compressed biscuits, marinated eggs, canned porridge, instant noodles, and plenty of drinking water. We prepared a simple gas stove, dry noodles, and rice, which could be used to cook food and boil water if necessary, considering nutritional needs. We bought boxes of apples and pears, as well as some dried vegetables and meat. Cleaning supplies were also essential. We bought lots of toilet paper, sanitary pads, and disposable underwear, to avoid running out of fuel or electricity on the road. My dad also bought a large barrel of diesel, an outdoor power source, and several power banks. Additionally, he prepared tools like knives, ropes, axes, and binoculars. My dad worked in construction, so he was skilled in making do with available materials. At home, we had a pickup truck used for hauling materials. We loaded it with all our stuff and wrapped everything in tarpaulins. After pondering for a moment, my mom tossed a few quilts and a bag of clothes onto the pile, just some simple sportswear. While they were still racking their brains to figure out if we were missing anything, I quietly opened up the map. I wanted to contribute something too. I had to drop out in my second year of high school due to poor health, but that didn't mean I was without any skills. I have an excellent memory and can recall events from a long time ago. The last time there was an explosion, the internet went down, but the radio kept receiving signals, so I could roughly remember the locations that had been bombed. I grabbed a pen and marked the spots that were about to be bombed. The more I recalled, the colder my heart felt. Our central region was almost completely devastated, with hardly any safe zones left. That night, a flood of memories washed over me, and the radio news echoed in my mind over and over. In a flash, I suddenly remembered something. One day, when I was hospitalized and seriously ill, I learned an important piece of information from a nurse changing my dressings. She mentioned that the government was planning to build a base in the mountains. I checked on my phone and it made sense. Nuclear bombs wouldn't be wasted on remote, uninhabited areas, and high rugged mountains could block radioactive dust. I suddenly sat up, pushed open my parents' bedroom door, and shared this information with them. After a busy day, my parents were already asleep, but they quickly sat up when they heard me. My mom responded swiftly, "The mountains would be safe, right?" After hearing my reasoning, my dad had an epiphany. "I know where we should go." He mentioned Yunchuan County was a suitable place. Over 50 years ago, my grandfather had responded to the national call for the Third Front movement and moved to Yunchuan County at the southwest border, starting from scratch. Enduring hardships, they transformed a barren land into a large-scale mechanical factory known as Yunchuan Machinery Plant. The factory was once very prosperous, employing over 4,000 workers. However, as the old state-owned enterprise declined, it was gradually relocated around the year 2000, and now the area is uninhabited. The surrounding area is sparsely populated and the factory is surrounded by rivers, so there is no shortage of water sources. Such a remote location would be out of reach from nuclear bombs, and the surrounding mountains could block the drifting radioactive dust. It would be an ideal haven after the apocalypse. My mom agreed. When these Third Front factories were built, they underwent strict scrutiny, all chosen as good places to avoid war chaos, and inside Yunchuan Machinery Plant, there's a very deep air raid shelter. We used to hide there during air raid drills when I was a child, my dad added, his eyes gleaming. They excitedly discussed for a long time before concluding, "Let's sleep now, we have a busy day tomorrow." The next morning, my parents continued to shop for supplies, and I went to the airport to pick up my brothers. My elder brother, James, a third-year student at the Agricultural University, sports a six-pack and works out daily, appearing sharp and often sarcastic, but he's actually quite whiny and spoiled in private. My second brother, Jacob, a second-year student in a science and engineering program, is always serious and dressed in shirts and trousers, a scheming and profound person who focuses on big projects, despite their differences. The two brothers share a strange kind of harmony. The first thing they said in unison after getting off the plane was, "Little sister, who's been bullying you?" The second thing, "Why has he come back too?" I dragged them out of the airport with one hand each. Once in the car, I held them back as they were about to ask questions. "Our family hasn't encountered any trouble. I lied to you, but a nuclear war is going to break out in 5 days, and most people will die. We need to stick together as a family." Both brothers looked at me. Moments later, both of them nodded in agreement. It was only later that I learned they didn't actually believe there would be a war, but seeing my determination, they chose to trust me. When we returned home, I found that my dad had loaded all the renovation tools and some building materials onto the pickup truck. He said the residential building in the abandoned factory had been deserted for 20 years. And it was uninhabitable without renovations. My mom had gone to the mall to buy more cotton bedding and clothes for changing, including both winter and summer attire, because conservatively estimating, we might end up staying there for a year or two, maybe even longer. She also prepared kitchen supplies thoroughly, almost like setting up a small family kitchen. We also stocked up on a considerable amount of medicines, a whole large box, ranging from antibiotics and cold medicines to treatments for injuries, headaches, and gastroenteritis, not to mention a good supply of bandages, adhesive plasters, gauze, and hemostatic powder. The pickup was packed full, and my dad had rented another van, reasoning that since both of my brothers had driver's licenses, it would be safer for our family to travel in 2 vehicles. My eldest brother, a graduate student in agriculture, had bought a large variety of seeds as well as sweet potatoes and potatoes, saying that once we got there, we would have to be self-sufficient. My second brother went to buy solar panels and various mechanical equipment and tools, which filled most of the van. I was also busy, first following online recommendations to order 3 apocalyptic Bibles from the nearest online bookstore, the Barefoot Doctor's Manual, the Militia Training Manual, and the Military Civil Dual-Use Talent Guide. The Barefoot Doctor's Manual provided solutions to various medical issues, all feasible under rudimentary conditions. With it, most health issues could be managed. The Militia Training Manual taught how to quickly form a competent armed force and included a particularly useful chapter on protection after a nuclear explosion. The Military Civil Dual-Use Talent Guide, though seemingly disorganized, was very practical, covering everything from military agriculture, small farm machinery, civil construction, and cooking, to less practical knowledge like accounting and photography. Rumor had it that with these 3 books, no matter what era or situation one found themselves in, they could become a legendary figure. While waiting for the books to arrive, I downloaded various books and many movies and novels online. During our breaks, we watched the news, which was full of border disputes and negotiation sessions. Rumors were rampant, but most believed the situation would be resolved without escalating to war, including the experts, who appeared very confident, treating it as a mere crisis. Just like in my previous life, this blind confidence from the experts left us unprepared for the dire consequences that followed. By the time we finished, it was past midnight. Fearing the night would bring more troubles, we filled up the gas and set off. The drive to Yunchuan was about 300 kilometers, calculating the time. We expected to arrive by around 5 in the morning. To prevent any issues from my brothers, our parents had me sit between them in the truck, keeping an eye on them throughout the journey. Sure enough, it wasn't long before the 2 strapping young men started arguing over the route. One thought the highway was faster, the other felt the national road was safer. I ended the dispute with a firm decision: stop arguing, listen to Dad. Through the walkie-talkie, my dad gave a clear answer. Considering the checks, there are checkpoints everywhere, especially now during this sensitive negotiation period, so let's take the highway. It looks less suspicious. If we're questioned, we'll say we're moving houses, and you guys are delivering parts to a machinery factory. Later, just as expected, we encountered 2 inspections, and with my dad's savvy, we passed them perfectly. At 4:30 in the morning, we entered Yunchuan County, and just when we felt safe, we faced the 3rd inspection. This time, several fully armed middle-aged policemen arrived. After a thorough inspection with their equipment, they asked us to open the van. Where are you headed? Long haul, delivering parts to a machinery factory in Guizhou. My older brother, wearing a cap, tried to appear calm. Oh, he scrutinized us, delivering parts overnight. I was extremely nervous, feeling guilty without committing any crime. I guessed my older brother felt the same. As he gripped the steering wheel tightly, his veins bulging, for a straightforward and simple man like him, lying was quite difficult. At the critical moment, my second brother casually asked, "Officer, we urgently need these parts. Is there any problem?" The middle-aged police officer waved his hand, signaling us to go, finish the delivery and head back quickly, and be safe. After we passed, I looked back at the police officer, who still stood there, watching our movements. My older brother took a deep breath. That scared me to death. Nearly got caught halfway. I felt uneasy too and whispered to my brothers, "I think he suspected something." My second brother grinned. With the current situation being tense, it's normal for people to feel uneasy. Since he let us go, we're safe. Afterwards, weighed down by my thoughts, the 3 of us didn't speak again. A sense of defeat and helplessness overwhelmed me. As we left, we agreed not to disclose anything under the guise of being good-hearted. First, no one would believe us, and second, exposing ourselves would only bring trouble. We're not saviors. We can't save this crumbling world. All we can do is save ourselves when we're under a collapsing wall. The most we could do was subtly inform our relatives and friends after ensuring our own safety. An hour after leaving Yunchuan County, our car snaked through a narrow, steep mountain road. Looking over the guardrail, there was a rushing river. The area was desolate and nearly uninhabited. Around 6 o'clock, we finally arrived at Yunchuan Machinery Factory. The heavy iron gate was rust-covered, and tall weeds knee-high surrounded the large but decrepit factory building, resembling a long-dead beast. This would be our new home. We struggled to pry open the large iron lock and drove the 2 cars in. That's when something strange happened. From the grass near the left side of the factory, a hunched shadow appeared. I was startled and about to alert my family when the grass shook slightly, and the shadow disappeared. I stared in disbelief, rubbing my eyes hard, and looked at the desolate grass for a long time. "Did you see a shadow?" They all said no. Confused, I said, "I thought I saw someone by the bushes." My father and older brother went to check it out, but found nothing. Yunchuan Machinery Factory has been deserted for a while. Everyone has moved away, unless some homeless person was passing by, my father said with certainty. I must have been mistaken, especially since I was highly tense all night and hadn't slept at all in the car. By now, it was 7 in the morning and daylight was upon us. We parked the cars on the open ground of the factory, ate some dry food, and then went to look for a suitable place to live. Leaving the factory, a major road stretched forward with many houses that seemed to be a residential area. We walked past the employee club, the sports field, the hospital, all battered and frozen in time from 20 years ago. Finally, we stopped in the family quarters. These 4 to 5-story buildings, mostly corridor-connected tube buildings, were all corners covered with moss and weeds, and the doors and windows were nearly all broken. But compared to other places, this area was more suitable for living. My father, who was used to doing renovations, inspected with his hands behind his back. Not bad, just needs a bit of cleaning and it'll be livable. My father was a small contractor, usually commanding around a dozen workers. At that moment, he showcased his talent for leadership. He instructed his older brothers to drive the car in, then they began the cleanup, shoveling all the discarded stones and debris outside onto the open ground. My mother and I cleaned the walls, tearing off the stained and blotchy newspapers before scraping off the flaking plaster with a small shovel, with many hands making light work. It only took us a couple of hours to clear out 3 rooms on the first floor. After a long search, my dad found several intact glass windows elsewhere and replaced the broken ones by taking from one wall to patch another. We also used wooden boards to fix up 3 simple doors, equipped with locks and bolts for normal use. We picked up some bricks for a base, laid down wooden boards and cotton padding to make simple beds, and even nailed together some wooden tables and benches. Outside the door, we built a stove using stones. The area was surrounded by dry branches and trees, providing an endless supply of fuel for burning. As for the water source, my second brother had specifically checked it. The wide river was very clear, just to be safe. We also prepared a large number of purification tablets and quicklime, which could further purify the water. It took us 1 day to tidy up. Although everything was very basic, it was a decent temporary dwelling, because we were busy in the morning and at noon. We just ate some dry food, but in the evening my mother cooked our first dinner at the base. She boiled a large pot of sweet potato porridge, stir-fried some wild vegetables, and cooked a few homemade sausages. This meal, which would be considered modest at home, tasted delicious here, especially after a day's hard work, which left us exhausted. Each of us had a large bowl. Our family sat in the spacious yard, looking at the desolate abandoned factory, each lost in their own thoughts. My eldest brother was quite puzzled. Is there really going to be a war? Mom, Dad, sister, could it be some kind of illusion you all are having? The 3 of us were certain and uncontrollably began describing the horrific memories from our past lives. My second brother adjusted his glasses. Typically, a country would bolster its reserves of oil and gold before preparing for war. They would also compulsorily requisition and hoard essential supplies like cotton, medicine, steel, wood, and food. But I've checked all the recent news, and there's no trace of such activities. To be honest, I also find it strange, I said confidently. If there were early signs, the country wouldn't be so unprepared. The only possibility is that we've been deceived. Do you mean we thought it was negotiation, but it was actually a trap? My eldest brother frowned. I nodded. Country is always full of tricks and has no credibility. Plus, with their numerous puppet states, it's normal for them to act shamelessly. My second brother agreed. They must have been preparing for war for a while, simply looking for any pretext that would benefit them. My dad also agreed with this view. But this is a scenario where both sides will suffer. Once nuclear weapons are involved, no one can emerge unscathed. We fell silent. Indeed, human conspiracies always aim to target others, but in the end, they often lead to mutual destruction. We were too ordinary, powerless against the complexities of the world. We discussed and decided to subtly warn our relatives and friends as per our initial plan. We each sent out messages, all roughly saying that the current situation seemed off, advising them to stock up on supplies and find bomb shelters in advance. However, the responses were disappointing. They were all very perfunctory. There are always similar marketing messages every day. Don't worry, a war won't happen. Those who are meant to die will die. There's no escaping it. Let's not worry about that. Why prepare? If there really is a war, the national reserves are surely ample, so rest assured. We each sat there, shaking our heads. Actually, this was an outcome we had anticipated, yet when it occurred, we still felt a sense of helplessness. That night, we went to bed early. I thought I would be unable to sleep and feel scared, but after a whole day of exhausting endeavors, the moment I lay down, I fell asleep. Just before dawn, I thought I heard some rustling footsteps outside the window. It seemed like someone was by the window. But how could that be possible? I was too lazy to open my eyes, so I just turned over and went back to sleep. When I got up in the morning, it was already 8 o'clock. I headed to the slope behind the house to use the restroom. As I passed the back window, I was startled. Beneath the dusty windowsill, there were 2 footprints smeared with yellow mud, which trailed off up the slope and then disappeared. So, the sounds I heard weren't an illusion. There really was someone peering through our window. It was truly chilling to think that this person could be a wanted criminal or a psychopath, like a ticking time bomb ready to explode at any moment. I immediately informed my family about this, and everyone was very alert, prepared to find out who this mysterious person was. There were too many abandoned buildings in the factory area, so we put down our work and began a thorough search. Around noon, My older brother sent a message saying they had found the person. It wasn't a criminal or a psychopath as we feared, but an old man. My father was stunned for a few seconds. How is that possible? People moved away from here 20 years ago, and I don't remember anyone choosing to stay. We hurried over to the far end of the factory area, where in a small bungalow, we met the old man. He was wearing an old, faded work uniform and was busy with a hoe in the field. Seeing us approaching, he looked confused and a bit nervous. My brother whispered, "The old man just asked me if I was here for a buyout." It was awkward to respond. The old man moved his lips and spoke up. "What are you here for? Is this factory being rebuilt?" My father stared at him for a few seconds, then excitedly rushed over and grabbed his hand. "Uncle Lou, do you recognize me? I'm Jason." Jason. The old man was even more puzzled. Jason, the electrician's second son. My father was genuinely excited, bursting into an animated recount. "When I was a kid, I even stole coal briquettes from your house, and you chased me around the factory with a broom, remember?" After hearing this, the old man's lips twitched slightly, showing an expression as if he was grinding his teeth. "That's hard to forget," my father, with an expression of finding a long-lost friend, said. "Didn't everyone from the factory move away? How come you're still here?" As they exchanged pleasantries, I gathered most of the story. It turned out that Grandpa had not been very fortunate in life. His wife had died early, and he had no children, leaving him with no one else to care about. So, when everyone moved, he adamantly chose not to follow. Ignoring everyone's advice, he stayed alone in this deserted, abandoned factory, where he had lived for over 20 years. He took us to see where he lived. A simple little courtyard with 2 dogs, his only companions in his lonely life. He told us he grew his own crops, raised chickens, and occasionally fished in the river, so surviving was not an issue. For essentials like oil, salt, soy sauce, and vinegar, he had someone bring them over, a fishing enthusiast who visited every month or two. "Aren't you lonely living alone all this time?" my mother asked. He shook his head. "I got used to it." He then asked why we had come here, and my father hesitated before vaguely explaining, "We had a bit of trouble at home. Just here to lay low for a while." Grandpa immediately understood. "Oh, you're in debt, right? Everything's normal." "Normal. A few years back, we had someone in debt staying with us for several months," said Grandpa. Grandpa mentioned that he noticed us yesterday, seeing us in a car. He thought we were buyers or something and was a bit worried about being disturbed. Now that he knows we are hiding from debtors, he feels relieved. The conversation was both pleasant and awkward. As we said goodbye and were leaving, my oldest brother was clearly not pleased. "Do we look like people who would have bad habits?" The second brother glanced at him sideways. "Remove the we. It's you who looks it." "Nonsense. Believe it or not, I'll slap you," the oldest brother said, moving quickly to grab the second brother by the neck with his elbow, but the second brother quickly wriggled free. On the way back, the two of them kept fooling around. My parents and I are used to it and just followed behind, smiling quietly. After returning, we continued with our infrastructure work. Currently, we need to solve 2 major problems: unloading the items from the car and preparing water storage in advance. Logically, this place being an abandoned factory with no population around, there's almost no chance of it being bombed, but, having died once, we are still extra cautious and determined to be fully prepared. My dad had lived here for many years and vaguely remembered the location of the air raid shelters, though they were locked. They were just old-fashioned iron locks, easily opened with tools. The air raid shelter was very dry but reeked of a strong smell of machine oil. Using flashlights, we saw many machines wrapped in plastic sheets inside. That afternoon, we drove the car to the entrance and stored most of the water, emergency medicines, and other survival resources there. Only the items we needed for the next few days remained in the car. As for water storage, the factory had several water reservoirs. We chose 2 indoor ones with tight seals. These reservoirs hadn't been used for years and were quite dirty with a lot of moss. We thoroughly cleaned these 2 tanks with tools, then used a hose to channel water from the river to fill them up, and left them overnight with water purification tablets. The next day, after draining and rinsing the reservoirs again, we refilled them with clean water, now ready to use. While we were working, Grandpa curiously watched us several times, occasionally giving advice on the fastest routes. The more he watched, the more puzzled he became. "Why are you moving so much stuff and cleaning the water tanks?" my dad half-jokingly and half-seriously said. "With all the intense negotiations recently, what if a war breaks out? It's always good to be prepared." Grandpa shook his head vigorously. "What war?" Those little devils wouldn't dare to mess with us. If they come, we'll flatten them, I sighed inwardly. His thinking was still stuck in the era of wars from years ago. Indeed, after the nuclear war in our previous lives, we had mobilized the whole country to retaliate destructively against Country M, but killing 1,000 enemies cost us 800 of our own. We also suffered heavily in the war. In any war, no country can emerge unscathed. The escalating flames of war destroy everyone. For ordinary people like us, the chances of survival are very slim, and luck plays a significant role. For instance, our neighbors were lucky. 3 of them managed to secure 2 spots in a government air raid shelter and survived. We dare not gamble with our lives. Having died once, we know the pain all too well and wouldn't dare risk it again. Over the next 2 days, we did a lot of infrastructure work. My brothers reinforced the factory doors, found some discarded lime, and took turns whitewashing the walls of several rooms. Since the brick-block bed legs made for an uneven sleeping surface, my oldest brother, who slept terribly, one night collapsed the brick bed, so my dad took up carpentry again. He gathered materials and made several wooden beds. They looked a bit rough, but had a natural charm, and you could still smell the fresh scent of the wood when you lay on them. My mom and I weren't idle either. We cleaned out another room to use as a kitchen, organizing everything neatly and setting up the cassette stove and wood-burning stove inside. This way, we wouldn't have to worry about cooking during rainy or windy days. Now, the tube-shaped apartment dormitory began to feel a bit like home. I even made some window curtains from white gauze. After finishing these tasks, my mom started preparing dinner. Since it was spring, the factory area was overrun with wild vegetables. She picked a lot of wild onions, stir-fried them with cured meat, and harvested plenty of tender shepherd's purse to make a salad with water-soaked fermented black beans and spicy millet peppers. She also cooked several shepherd's purse pancakes. A fragrant dinner was ready. The dinner had been ready for a while, but my 2 brothers hadn't come back yet. Over the phone, they said they were still draining water and would come home after finishing. Worried the food would get cold, I packed it in a lunchbox and went to find them at the reservoir. When I arrived, my eldest brother was shirtless, rolling up his trouser legs and pulling on a hose. I waved the lunchbox at him, and after swallowing his saliva, he blurted out, "I won't eat until I'm done today. You can eat or starve, I don't care," I muttered before going to find my second brother. He was idly swinging his legs, sitting by the reservoir, lost in thought as he watched the slowly rising water level. Seeing me, he scooted over and pulled me up next to him. We sat side by side, watching the water in the reservoir and the golden glow of the setting sun on our eldest brother's figure. After a while, I leaned on my second brother's lean shoulder, too sleepy to keep my eyes open. Eventually, my eldest brother finished up with the hose and came over, and the 3 of us sat by the reservoir eating dinner. The 2 brothers started bickering about how sharing a room meant neither could sleep well. The second brother complained about the eldest talking in his sleep, while the eldest grumbled about the second getting up too early and disturbing him. They were really noisy, but I was also truly grateful. In a past life, they had died without a trace, and we never got to say goodbye. Now, under the sunset, their arguing was a picture of peaceful times. I hoped these peaceful times would continue, but I was worried because, according to the trajectory of the past life, a nuclear war was set to break out tomorrow night. That evening, I watched the news, which was all about the upcoming 5th round of talks in the morning. The media and officials were clear about their stance on these negotiations, publicly expressing, "A lot of effort has been made, and there is great confidence in reaching an agreement." I put down my phone, tired of the confusing news reports. In a past life, it was our blind trust in these reports that led us to walk unguarded into death. The next morning, we closely followed the live broadcast of the 5th round of negotiations. Being in the deep mountains, the signal was poor, and the intermittent feed made the viewing quite nerve-wracking. The first half seemed promising, with the talks going smoothly, but the atmosphere changed drastically in the second half, leading to a complete breakdown. The representative from Country M tore off the diplomatic mask, forcefully proposing an absurd reconciliation plan that demanded concessions from us on everything from territory to trade agreements. Our diplomats refused to back down, and the tension was palpable, almost as if they might come to blows at any moment. In the end, the 5th round of talks failed. My brothers watched, filled with righteous indignation, one cursing, the other clenching his fists, as if they wished they could jump through the screen and fight. My parents and I were pale, exchanging glances. Our slight hope had burst like a bubble, as this round of negotiations was exactly like the one in our previous life. It seemed the nuclear war was indeed going to break out tonight. My father paced back and forth on the leaf-strewn ground outside the door, saying, "Shouldn't we make one more effort to alert the people outside, Dad? They won't believe us." I shook my head. "We tried warning our relatives and friends the other day, but it was no use." My mother agreed. Yes, they'll just dismiss these warnings as rumors, but my father was adamant, if they could just listen a little, we could save many lives. In the end, my father decided to take one more risk. He dialed the National Security Bureau and solemnly reported the nuclear explosion that was expected to occur that evening. Unconvinced by the lack of response, he spent half the day searching online and posted several warning videos on social platforms. Unfortunately, those videos were immediately removed by the platform for inciting rumors. The call he made was taken seriously, but they just placated him with a few words to trust the authorities and then hung up. My father was utterly disappointed, along with us, who stood silently by his side. We all let out a deep sigh. When nothing happens, no matter how loudly you scream, they think it's just a case of crying wolf. We genuinely didn't have convincing evidence. We couldn't persuade anyone, except for our family who believed us unconditionally. After a while, my father recovered and asked my two brothers to check on the bomb shelter again, in a previous life. The nuclear missile trajectory posed no threat to Yunchuan County, but we couldn't be too sure. At 6 in the evening, our family entered the bomb shelter. We even forcibly brought along Grandpa, who was cooking at the time. Grandpa resisted all the way, but my father was persistent, and he had to come. Interestingly, his two dogs, very protective of him, followed us into the shelter. The shelter, built to wartime specifications, was very sturdy and secure. Originally a natural cave shaped like a gourd, narrow on the outside and deep within, it had been converted into a shelter. 2 reinforced doors were added during construction, one on the outside and another inner door, making it extremely secure. We settled in at the very back of the shelter, sitting on crates, tense and anxious. I kept my eyes on my watch. It was 18:57. Half an hour until the nuclear explosion. My mother looked pale, holding me close while pulling my two brothers closer to her side. My father, with a serious expression, sat on the edge, his eyes fixed on the door. Unmoving, only Grandpa kept muttering along the way, thinking of explosions. What nonsense, I've lived here for decades without even an earthquake. His two dogs sat beside him, barking occasionally in response to his voice. Time passed by second in the tense atmosphere. My father repeatedly reminded us, close your eyes, hold your breath, and lie face down on the ground. I stared at my watch, silently counting down. 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds. In a past life, because we were so close to the blast, the ground shook violently, and the fierce winds hurled stones at the garage door. It was unstoppable. The intensity of the vibration was immense, lasting a long time like muffled thunder. I was terrified then, thinking that the next second, it would tear us apart. So this time, I started counting silently, and at 10 seconds, I tightly closed my eyes and covered my ears. Then, my two brothers threw themselves over me, shielding me with their bodies, pressed under them. My back was tense, my whole body trembling. I could feel they were trembling too. In that extreme tension, my mind lost all sense of time, and so, time ticked by second. The expected shakes and roars never came, and everything remained normal. Grandpa got restless and stood up, saying, "What explosion? There shouldn't be any. I need to go home and cook." It took several deep breaths before I mustered the courage to get up and open my eyes. I glanced at the time. It was already 19:35. 3 minutes had passed since the time of the supposed explosion. We forcibly held back Grandpa, insisting until after 8 o'clock. When we nervously opened the door of the bomb shelter, outside was pitch black, with only the sounds of unidentified insects, creating a seemingly tranquil atmosphere as if nothing had happened. We all were glued to our mobile phones, trying to find out the latest updates, but the signal was very weak, making it difficult to even open a browser. After what felt like an eternity, my older brother seemed to have found some news. He looked up, his face streaming with sweat. "The explosions have happened. There have been multiple blasts in the southern and central regions, and the extent of casualties is still unclear. The network stations there are down." "It really happened," my dad said, his face grim. My heart raced as I looked around the dark surroundings, unsure if this place would remain a safe haven, but compared to other places, it was relatively safe. After standing motionless for a while, Grandpa called his two dogs and said he was going home. We tried to persuade him otherwise, but he was adamant. "What's meant to happen will happen. Don't worry about me. I've lived long enough." Grandpa insisted on going home, worried about potential nuclear strikes in the following days. We stayed in the bomb shelter for several more days. Everyone was anxious. Even my usually cheerful eldest brother looked worried. He had thought we were overreacting, just taking a few days off school to have a trip to the countryside. Little did we expect it to come to this. We managed to access some news online. Nuclear alarms had been sounded in multiple areas of the southern and central regions of our country, and country had destroyed several ports and key military bases. The places where we once lived were now engulfed in conflict. After the nuclear explosion, our country launched a full-scale attack on country. Just like in past conflicts, allied nations joined the fray, some seizing the opportunity to provoke further or acting out of mutual dependency. The nuclear war we thought would never happen had just erupted, one day. An explosion nearby made us feel a slight tremor even inside the bomb shelter. We guessed it was no more than 50 or 60 kilometers away from us. Then, the network signals completely died out, and the radio only picked up static. It might have been due to the destruction of the transmission stations. By then, we were finally convinced that the conflict wouldn't reach us here. However, it was still unsafe outside, and we might have to stay here for a long time. Possibly until the complete cessation of hostilities. This could take months, or even a year or two. With many uncertainties in between, we had to be prepared for a prolonged struggle. However, our current food supplies wouldn't last that long. That evening, we held a family meeting to discuss our immediate priorities. Accommodation was already sorted, but we needed to construct a toilet and washing area. We had to hurry with planting and farming. If we couldn't develop sustainability, we would soon starve. Especially with 5 people, there were also concerns about safety and electricity. During these times of conflict, desperate people might seek refuge in the mountains, and in their desperation, robberies and murders could occur. Currently, we were using oil lamps for lighting. Some of the equipment is powered by previously stored portable batteries, so we need to set up the power generators quickly. My father adopts the contracting team model for meetings. Everyone discusses their issues, takes responsibility for their own area, and within 10 minutes, the work direction is set. My eldest brother is in charge of farming, while my second brother takes care of security and power supply. My father hasn't assigned me any tasks, he said. There's no need for you, sister. Just help mom with the cooking. Eldest brother, don't worry about working. Little sister, just focus on having fun. Second brother, last time you helped with moving the logs, you cut your hand and bled quite a bit. It's better if you just stay at home with mom. Embarrassed. I looked at the scar on my palm that had already healed and declared my resolve. No, I want to help my brothers with their tasks. Although my 2 brothers often quarrel with each other, they are both very protective of me. I'm quite introverted. In high school, I was bullied over a trivial matter. I tried to endure it, but the bullying escalated. Over time, I became very depressed and even dropped out of school. Later, my eldest brother noticed something was wrong and confronted the bullies at school. One of them had some influence and managed to get my brother into trouble. Fortunately, my second brother was prepared and produced evidence that we were being bullied and were acting in self-defense, which finally resolved the issue. My brothers have always been so good to me, and I feel for them, so I wanted to lend a hand. In Yunchuan, there are many uncultivated lands with traces of past cultivation. My eldest brother took some measuring tools and planned the layout, then started weeding and plowing. He plans to plant sweet potatoes, and corn since they are easy to manage and can serve as both food and vegetables. Additionally, he planned to plant various seasonal vegetables. With these and some wild vegetables we already have, our meals are well taken care of. Farming is my eldest brother's comfort zone. Being a graduate student in agriculture, he has been working with the land since his freshman year. He knows exactly what to do at each step. However, this kind of work can't be rushed. It's all manual labor. My eldest brother used to work out daily. Here, his farm work goes smoothly, and under the sunlight, his well-defined muscles and bulging veins showcase his vigor and strength. Whenever I hand him tools or bring him water, I always think that if he had shown off his physique earlier, he might have already had a wife. When I mentioned this, he seriously told me that many people are interested in him, but he isn't considering these matters right now. My second brother seems more relaxed, wandering around with his tools like an electrician, occasionally installing something or hammering away, making security measures seem like a game. There are 2 main entrances to the Yunchuan machinery factory, the main gate and a side path. My second brother repaired the gate and installed electric fences and surveillance at both places. These measures won't stop a large-scale invasion, but they are sufficient to deter petty intruders. Moreover, he set up several solar panels and a small wind turbine he brought with him, solving our lighting, bathing, and communication issues. He also found some spare parts in an abandoned warehouse and crafted a simple rotary tiller, seed spreader, and irrigation system. With these machines, my eldest brother is even more efficient, quickly planting the first batch of crops to ensure their growth. He also built simple greenhouses. Later, we also got some chicks and ducklings from Grandpa, built chicken coops and duck pens, and dug a small pond for the ducks. We also stocked the pond with fish from the river, ready to be caught whenever we fancy. We truly began living an idyllic rural life. As dawn breaks, we rise to work, and as dusk falls, we rest. Life is simple, comfortable, and content. By the end of April, the radio finally started picking up faint signals. However, the broadcasts were disappointing, all about the war. It seemed most places had fallen. We tried contacting friends and relatives, but phone calls couldn't go through, and the internet was unreachable. We assumed that communication towers would be rebuilt eventually, but likely not prioritizing remote areas like ours. Being able to catch even fragmented news from the outside world through the radio felt like a stroke of luck. Grandpa visited our farmhouse daily, initially offering guidance as the elder, but later he became somewhat sentimental, remarking that we were quite proficient at farming. He asked, "Do you really plan to stay here permanently?" "Of course not." My dad shook his head. "We'll return as soon as it's safe outside." "It's hard to know what it's like out there now." He squinted. "My fishing buddy hasn't shown up for a long time," my dad offered. "Do you need anything? We've got everything here. I can bring you some oil, salt, soy sauce, and vinegar." Grandpa looked at him gratefully. "I insist on paying, though." "All right, just keep track of it then," my dad replied. My brother and I chuckled on the side, thinking that money might not be so easy to spend these days. Indeed, Grandpa's friend hadn't visited. If any strangers approached, our installed surveillance would alert us promptly, but recently, it had been eerily quiet, truly not a soul around. Worried about potential nuclear dust, we tested the water with prepared strips before use each day. Luckily, that concern was unnecessary. Surrounded by high mountains, no contamination had drifted our way. That evening, after finishing our chores, we sat in the courtyard enjoying the cooler air. Summer brought an abundance of mosquitoes, so Mom lit some mugwort for smoke and served us a watermelon that had been chilled in the storage pond. The watermelon was an unexpected delight. Earlier today, my elder brother stumbled upon a forgotten melon patch near the slope. Not many, but all ripe and plump. They were juicy, sweet, and refreshing, though the only downside was too many seeds, which were a bit of a nuisance. My parents fiddled with the radio, trying to catch the latest news of the war, but the static was too intense to make anything out. Bored, my two brothers and I watched a movie on a laptop. We shared similar tastes in movies, zombie, mystery, and horror genres, so when the sound turned up, our parents disapprovingly glanced at us and took the radio inside. Today's film was aptly about survivors navigating the ruins of a post-apocalyptic world. Leaning against my elder brother and resting my feet on the other, I whispered, "Does this count as the apocalypse for us too? If we go back, do I still have to go to school?" The thought of school made me reflexively withdraw. It was after leaving school that the shadows began to fade from my heart. The wilderness here felt like a paradise, a haven from a frightening world. My elder brother seriously said, "If you don't want to go to school, you don't have to. I can take care of you." My other brother glanced at him. He only knows farming. "Will you just dig potatoes every day? Come with me to my school? I'll rent a place, and you can just hang out in parks and play games." I shook my head, feeling a bit spoiled by their indulgence. Maybe I should think about what I can do for them. I can't keep avoiding reality, avoiding people forever. Our vegetable garden is thriving, and a daily walk through it provides enough fresh picks for our meals. The fish in the pond have grown plump, perfect for making delicious dishes like sauerkraut fish and boiled fish. We can't even finish the eggs collected daily from the chicken and duck coops, so we preserve them by pickling. My mom even tried building a makeshift oven out of clay and bricks, successfully baking bread that my eldest brother loves. He can devour 4 in one sitting. Our daily routine, healthy diet, and proper labor have brought positive changes to our physical health. My dad used to suffer from mild hypertension, but his dizziness has now vanished. My mom, who frequently had migraines, hasn't had one since using a remedy Grandpa gave her. Previously, I would stay indoors, pale as a ghost from lack of sunlight, but now my cheeks are rosy and gleaming from regular sun exposure. My brothers, too, have become healthier through constant physical work. Even the thinner second brother has gained some muscle. We've grown to love this secluded life, away from the chaos and annoyances of the city. As the world seems to be ending, we've found our own paradise. By mid-July, we started receiving clear radio signals, and even the internet began to come back. Just like before, conflicts are erupting everywhere. The area near our home has become a complete mess. Fortunately, things are calmer near Yunchuan, with only one conflict occurring 50 kilometers away, all within controllable limits. Our remote location from the county town enhances our safety. We've managed to contact some relatives and friends online. However, the conversations are filled with tears and suppressed sorrow. Just like in the past, many have died, many are injured and in critical condition. Those lucky enough are hiding in safe bases, uncertain of when it will end. After every phone call, my dad laments, if only they had listened a bit earlier, they wouldn't be in such a dire situation. We invited some relatives who we're close to, but they couldn't make it because checkpoints everywhere are locked down. making travel nearly impossible. It's understandable, as the government troops are also trying to ensure everyone's safety, and there are many uncontrollable risks on the roads. We later heard that the government plans to build survival bases in remote mountain areas. Hearing this, our family fell silent. On one hand, it seems inevitable, on the other. We worry that the Yunchuan machinery factory might be targeted if a large number of people pour in. Chaos will ensue due to the long-term lack of supplies, leading to desperation. Theft, violence, and looting could become prevalent. In times of survival, the darkest aspects of human nature can fully emerge. After a long silence, my dad gestured dismissively. Let's cross that bridge when we come to it. He has always been a man of broad mind and stout body, rarely worrying about things that haven't happened yet, which keeps his spirits high. My two brothers, one always joking and the other quietly handling big issues, don't wear their worries on their faces. The ones in our family who are more aware of potential dangers are my mom and me. Our worries soon materialized. One day in August, before we had even gotten out of bed, the alarm on our surveillance system started beeping. My second brother quickly got up to check. After seeing the screen, he gasped, "There are two people outside at the electric fence." I leaned over to look. Indeed, there were two middle-aged men slowly approaching, the leader looking familiar. After staring for a few seconds, I suddenly realized, second brother, we've seen this man before. He's the police officer who questioned us at the highway checkpoint. Is that so? My brother squinted, grabbed his shirt from the chair, and put it on. I'll go over and check out the situation first. You all just stay at home and don't go anywhere. Worried that my second brother might be at a disadvantage alone, I quickly went to wake up my eldest brother and father. They both followed swiftly. My mother and I were also restless at home, constantly feeling like something big was about to happen. Later, I climbed to the rooftop of this tube-shaped building, took out a telescope, and looked towards the place. The electric fence at the gate was intact, and there was no one there anymore. After watching for a while, I noticed that my father and the others were already on their way back. About to reach the building, I ran downstairs in haste, panting as I asked, "What happened?" I could clearly sense that something serious had occurred from the odd expressions on the faces of the three of them. My father sighed deeply. That police officer had actually been suspicious of us for a while and knew we went to the Yunchuan machinery factory. What do you mean? I was utterly speechless. We didn't break any laws. It's not that. My second brother looked at us. He came to us today to inform us about something. From tomorrow, they will start sending refugees here, and we need to accommodate them. My mother muttered, "Won't that create chaos? Can't we just say we don't have enough resources here to support that many people?" My eldest brother shook his head. They already checked with satellite maps before deciding to send them here, so it's more of a notification, not a negotiation. My father added, I also mentioned that we don't have enough resources, but they said the people coming are all able-bodied workers. After much discussion, they agreed to try and provide whatever resources we really need. After some thought, we called Grandpa over and held a meeting together. Everyone agreed that now that it had come to this, we had to help our fellow countrymen, but we needed to consider how to go about it. We can currently only sustain ourselves, if dozens, or even hundreds more come. Survival would become a problem. Grandpa was quite pleased. He said that the place had been deserted for 20 years, and now it was getting lively. He gestured expansively. Isn't this just like when we first came here? We had nothing back then either. This reminded my father, who suddenly exclaimed, "We can totally use the model from decades ago to manage this." We were all confused, but he confidently dismissed us to go to sleep with peace of mind. My mother nodded vigorously, planning to start preparations early the next morning, saying she was actually looking forward to having some company to chat with. Before going to sleep, I heard my eldest brother humming a song in the shower next door, clearly in a good mood. Soon after, my second brother knocked on my door, peeking in to ask, "Is my charger in your room?" After I handed it to him, he smiled, wished me good night, and urged me to sleep early. I couldn't help but blurt out, "Aren't you guys worried? So many people are coming, why worry, compared to them, who have been fleeing for so long and are arriving in an unfamiliar environment? They are the ones who should be more anxious," my second brother replied, turning his head so the moonlight fell on his prominent nose, his face calm and composed. "Well, it seems I'm the only one in the family who's anxious, but I have social anxiety. I'm really scared of facing a crowd of people, especially after a war, and surely there will be many conflicts, just like when I was bullied in school." Noticing my mood, my second brother reached out and pinched my cheek. "Just stick with your brother tomorrow. Will it be okay?" "Yes, I promise." The next morning at 10, the first batch of post-war refugees arrived, about 20 people, men and women of various ages, all looking worn and weary, their eyes filled with despair and confusion. This situation is just like when we initially fled for safety. Living in constant fear of life and death can cloud anyone's mind, not to mention the pain of losing loved ones, which would weigh heavily on anyone. My parents warmly welcomed everyone, leading them straight into an abandoned factory. Are we really settling everyone here? Not just those people, even I was confused. The factory walls were riddled with cracks and peeling paint, broken machinery and debris littered the floor, making the place look eerie and terrifying. Filled with the smell of dust and metallic odors, which was quite unpleasant, the place was in complete disarray, utterly unsuitable for living. The expressions on people's faces grew increasingly grim, shifting from confusion to doubt and slight anger. They wanted to live, but not in such a demeaning way. Like dogs, my dad, cheerful and outgoing, seemed completely oblivious to everyone's mood. Let's clean up this place this morning, we need an open space. The mood soured even further, with a couple of men even standing up. I assumed they wanted to fight or scramble for resources. Frightened, I instinctively closed my eyes and hid behind my older brother. Still, I could hear my dad's enthusiastic voice. We don't need to clean up a big area, just this part. We need a space to mass-produce furniture. Surely no one wants to sleep on the floor tonight. Furniture making. Everyone was taken aback. Yes, let's clean up first. Later, we'll select some people to make furniture, while the rest follow me to clean the rooms in the apartment building. We aim to move into a new home by tonight. Oh, all right. What about tools? Everyone responded, their spirits lifting. They quickly began cleaning, with my two brothers and dad helping out. My mom and I weren't idle either, following the police's list. We divided them into 6 dormitories. 5 rooms with bunk beds for 4, and 1 for couples. With many hands making light work, they cleared out over 100 square meters by 10 p.m. Then, my dad inquired and kept 8 skilled individuals to make furniture, while my 2 brothers took 11 people to clean rooms. Mom also took 3 women to start a fire for cooking. I was initially very nervous, but seeing everyone working so efficiently and energetically, I felt oddly inspired. I wasn't so scared anymore, after all. They were also unfortunate souls, our fellow sufferers. Cooking for many wasn't easy. Our cooking utensils were clearly too small. With no other choice, we scavenged in an abandoned house and found 2 old large iron pots, likely used for cooking pig feed before. But in critical times, it didn't matter. After cleaning them, my mom cooked a large pot of sweet potato rice. One of the women took charge of the fire. Another handled the vegetables, and the third skillfully stir-fried. All adept in their movements, in no time, 3 large pots of food were ready: stir-fried green peppers and potatoes, braised chicken, and a wild vegetable and duck egg soup. Honestly, the amount of food wasn't much, considering there were about 20 or 30 people. Each person could only get a spoonful of food, but everyone was excited, having not had a hot meal in a long time. A young boy, only in his teens, started crying as he ate. He said, "Before my mom died, she always wanted to drink some hot soup, but unfortunately, she never did." Hearing this, I felt really sad. I remembered the despair and sorrow from the past life when I received the news of my brother and parents' deaths, which I often recall. With that in mind, I scooped some egg from my bowl into his, whispering, "It's okay, you'll have soup every day from now on." I was afraid he might thank me or say something else, so I quickly took my bowl and sat elsewhere. I just didn't want to interact. By evening that day, they had cleared 6 rooms, and the makeshift beds and small tables were nearly complete. There wasn't enough cotton padding. When my family first arrived, we only brought a minimal amount, just enough for ourselves. Thus, only 1 pregnant woman received a quilt. The others had to make do with straw padding temporarily. However, in the morning while cleaning the factory, we found several large boxes of brand new gauze masks. Some of the women took them apart and managed to patch together some simple bed sheets. Fortunately, the season isn't too cold. By layering a few clothes at night, one could manage to sleep. They didn't mind at all, saying it was much better than they had expected. Having food, drink, and a place to stay, and not having to worry about dying outside, was a relief. For the next several days, we were constantly busy, repairing doors and windows, fixing the toilets, farming, and fishing. One particularly capable uncle even set traps in the wilderness, catching a few wild chickens and rabbits, which we then began to raise. My mom, along with a group of women, found plenty of wild sweet potatoes, yams, and potatoes on the nearby barren hill, dug them up, and brought them back, providing us meals for several days. With 20 to 30 people to feed, resources were tight, but everyone had an unspoken agreement. The best food was reserved first for the elderly, women, and children. And there was no fighting over it. Grandpa, kind-hearted as he is, came almost every day, bringing vegetables and fruit from his own garden, sometimes even chickens and a basket of eggs. Sometimes he'd join us for the communal meals and help out with work, saying it made him happy to see everyone, and it reminded him of his arrival here decades ago. He said, "Yunchuan machinery plant has finally come back to life." His eyes reddened as he spoke. Probably remembering relatives and colleagues who had left years ago, we were indeed living with a spirited and fiery determination. My dad, as the manager, had expectations for everyone. He established rules. Labor was divided by gender, work points were calculated based on labor, and then goods like food, quilts, clothing, and daily necessities were distributed according to those points. In other words, if you were lazy and shirked work, you wouldn't eat. The community was vigilant. And no lazy or useless person could escape notice. I was included in this too, although my older brothers often helped with my tasks, so I wasn't much more tired than usual. Under principles of fairness, transparency, and justice, these people were extremely grateful to our family and truly trusted us. One burly man confessed, "When I first came here, I thought if I wasn't treated well, I'd have to resort to violence. But now I see that you are sincerely good-hearted without hidden motives." My dad, ever casual, waved his hand. "No need for that. We all just want to survive. Unity is our only way." At that moment, I gained a new understanding of my dad. Before, I always thought he was a bit naive, a simple good guy, not as sharp as my older brothers. Now, I realized his honesty was his greatest strength. By being open and sincere, he avoided many problems. No wonder he'd been a successful contractor for so many years, with loyal and devoted workers, none of whom ever betrayed or deserted him. His character, not inclined towards making much money but rich in integrity and trust, ensured he would never live with guilt. On the 10th day, the police brought in 10 more people. This time they didn't come empty-handed but brought much-needed supplies: cotton padding, fabric, diesel, salt, clothes, hygiene products, and grains. The arrival of new supplies was welcome, but the arrival of new members meant another round of busyness. This time, however, our family didn't need to do everything ourselves. Those who were accustomed to life here warmly guided the newcomers, helping them integrate quickly. Almost every couple of weeks, refugees would arrive. Sometimes there were 5 or 6, other times there were more than a dozen. They appeared disheveled and worn, some even bearing injuries. Those with injuries were actually quite troublesome because they couldn't handle heavy labor and were essentially consuming resources. However, we tried our best to utilize their skills. For instance, one of them was a doctor, so after his arrival, he provided a lot of medical assistance and even helped deliver a baby for a woman in labor. Another was skilled in handicrafts. Although he couldn't work outside due to a leg injury, he kept busy in the yard making baskets, fences, and brooms. As my dad used to say, "We don't entertain idlers here. If you want to eat, you have to work." Freed from the pursuit of vain ambitions, our long-term involvement in a spiritually draining and competitive society came to an end, and we found tranquility instead. We lived a truly happy life reminiscent of the 1980s. There were no disparities in wealth, no cutthroat competition. We simply worked from sunrise to sunset. We encouraged each other during busy times and enjoyed the flowers and the moon during leisure, living carefree days. This lifestyle was the only pleasant surprise in these chaotic times. I'm still quite introverted now, preferring not to interact much with these people, wanting only to be with my brothers. Seeing that I wasn't very enthusiastic, they didn't force me, in a way, out of respect for my father. They were quite protective of me. Over time, I came to see them as a lovable group of people. Sometimes I would hide behind the crowd, listening to their jokes, smiling slightly, feeling as though I was part of them. This state continued until the end of the year, when our population had grown to over 600. We made use of every viable building. Besides 2 cylinder blocks, we renovated 2 dormitory buildings and refurbished the basketball court and the canteen. My dad couldn't manage so many people by himself anymore. He stepped back to only oversee and advise, acting as a patriarch. He delegated responsibilities. Some took care of infrastructure, some handled security, some managed livestock, some took charge of cultivation, and some oversaw the kitchen. It's worth mentioning that those in charge of security were strong young men with excellent enforcement capabilities. Once, they dealt harshly with a thug who tried to storm into our base. It's safe to say that apart from birds and bugs, no other creatures could intrude into our base and disrupt our lives. I also took on some responsibilities. Because of my strong memory and attention to detail, I was in charge of managing supplies, but every time we took inventory, many eager people came to help. This time, I felt warmth not only from my brothers, but from many others as well. At this moment, I finally believe that love can both demand and give, and that giving always brings rewards. Heaven does not disappoint the sincere. One day, among the refugees, there was a familiar face. It was a girl who had bullied me in the past and was the main reason behind my depression and dropping out of school. She was emaciated, with messy, tangled blonde hair and a fearful look in her eyes. Clearly, she had suffered a lot in recent months. Seeing me, she was exceptionally frightened, continuously holding a stone in her hand, warning me not to come any closer. I approached her, looking down from above. "I'm just here to tell you that you need to work, otherwise you have no right to live here." "Why should I?" She became angry. "The country won't just watch us die." I laughed. "There is no such thing as unearned good or evil. You have to pay a price for what you receive. Don't speak of high ideals until you've mustered enough courage." She looked at me nervously. "You want revenge, don't you?" I glanced at her with pity. "Do I need to? Look at what you've already become." She was stunned, then crouched in place for who knows how long before finally struggling to her feet and picking up her tools. I never bothered with her again. After a long time on alert, the panic in her eyes finally faded. By March of the following year, the news online was becoming increasingly pessimistic. The front lines kept being pushed back, shifting across many places. However, after experiencing the consequences of massacres, both sides reached a tacit agreement and lethal weapons were completely banned. Now, it was more about a prolonged daily attrition, with no end in sight. For 2 consecutive months, the middle-aged policeman who frequently brought refugees and supplies had not shown up. One day, we learned from his colleague that he had been hit by a stray bullet while escorting supplies out of town. He had been killed. We all fell silent upon hearing the news. Our relationship with this middle-aged policeman had always been complex. We feared him, yet we had to accept his arrangements. Over time, he had brought many refugees to us, and had grimly forced supplies upon us as well. We often found him annoying, as he brought us so many troubles. Now that he was dead, all we knew was that his surname was Zhang. He was about 50 years old, and he had a 15-year-old daughter. He died on the road and would no longer bother us. My usually cheerful father also lost his smile that day. He sighed. "I regret it a little. I should have invited old Jing for a drink. I even hid 2 bottles of good wine in the air raid shelter." Indeed, we had never even invited him for a meal, nor offered him a drink of water, let alone wine. That evening, I curled up on the bed in my older brother's bedroom watching a movie. The 3 of us stared at the computer screen, wordlessly heavy-hearted. I couldn't even make out what was on the screen. Then, tears inexplicably began to flow, falling on my older brother's back. He shuddered as if stunned, then turned his head and said to us, "I don't want to stay here anymore." "What?" I looked at him with reddened eyes. "This place probably doesn't need me anymore, but there are people out there who need help. Many places are calling for volunteers, for young people with knowledge and skills." My second brother gripped my hand tightly and looked up. "I feel the same way. What do you think, little sister?" I stared at them, somewhat disbelieving what I heard, yet feeling that it was inevitable. In my heart, I wanted to say that I needed them, that I wanted them to stay alive and by my side. I didn't care about those outside, but the words just wouldn't come out, so I bit my lip and remained silent. Later, under their gaze, I lowered my eyes. "Okay, just come back early." At the end of March, my older brothers left the base. My parents and I stood at the factory gate. Behind us were our brethren from the base. We waved at the car until it disappeared from sight. Though our eyes were red, none of us cried. We believed we would meet again. When that time comes, it surely won't be like today. We will walk out of here openly, on a land no longer scarred by war.